The pressure has been piling on for US President Joe Biden. His appearances at the NATO summit were heavily scrutinized, including internationally.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
Russian state media picked up on and amplified the gaffe.
В фарс превратилось мероприятие, которое подавали как историческое. Завершить саммит НАТО на высокой ноте не получилось. Главные акценты расставили оговорки по Байдену. Массовка в этом театре абсурда тоже подыграла.
Американский президент снова подкинул поводы для дискуссий вокруг его ментального здоровья. На закрытии саммита НАТО оговорки одна хлеще другой. Вот он приглашает на сцену Зеленского, только вот думает явно не о нем.
But right now, I'm joined by CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson, and so much to go through. I mean, all eyes on NATO, more so than ever before, because all about President Biden's performance. How have international leaders responded to some of the conversations they've had with President Biden?
I think the headline has to be exactly as you would expect them to, because they are not going to talk down the leader of another country. And also they recognize that he's a Democrat. For most of the NATO leaders, they'd rather deal with a Democrat than a Republican, particularly Donald Trump, who might want to weaken support for NATO. Who probably of all those leaders had the best insights? Well, Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister, had this really long, almost hour-long one-on-one with Biden, and he came out of that, and when asked by a British journalist, he gave a strong defense. He said, look, we went through all these different foreign policy issues at high speed, and he was on top of them. He got them. He was there in the detail. But again, I think there's that kind of little caveat that you wouldn't expect them to say something. And President Macron really came to Biden's defense too. He said he was on top of it. And they're all pointing to the fact that this is a complex summit where they had to get through a lot, and there were a lot of deliverables, and Biden steered in the room with the leaders, steered them all through it and got it done.
As you say, very unlikely that you'd have world leaders, speaking negatively about the US president, given that the alternative right now is a Donald Trump presidency, and we don't know what that would mean for NATO's future.
I think we got a hint yesterday because one of the NATO leaders, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who's just, by the way, his country has taken over the presidency of the Council of the EU, which is an influential position. It's a rotating presidency. You get it for 6 months. But as soon as he got that, he went to Kyiv, and he went to Moscow, and he went to Beijing and called it a peace tour. Then he went to Washington for the NATO summit. Then he went to Mar-a-Lago to see Donald Trump, talking up Donald Trump as a peacemaker, pitching his visit there as part of his peace tour. Donald Trump responded to Orban's social media by saying, hey, thank you, Victor. Yes, we need to end this war as soon as possible. No more people need to die. So that's everything we kind of need to know. Or maybe President Trump, again, if he gets re-elected as president, he would be all for ending the war as soon as possible, and everyone knows that would mean ceding territory, essentially rewarding President Putin, unless Donald Trump has another analysis and puts it forward, which he hasn't so far.
Yeah, I mean, so fascinating. The other thing that we've been discussing is just how the issues surrounding President Biden has overshadowed, in many respects, what's been coming out of NATO. What have you been hearing from world leaders, and whether they feel that the focus hasn't actually been on the outcomes of what NATO is trying to achieve and showing a unified NATO, but more so about what's happening domestically in the United States?
Yeah, and I think when you look at the NATO communique at the end, this is the strongest communique in years. It paints a picture of an increasingly polarized world where China is a decisive factor in Russia, they say, being able to have lots of weapons and therefore be a greater danger. So you're seeing this polarization in the world. And I think for the leaders there, that was one of the big messages they wanted to get out: the defense and deterrence, and why we're ready, and how we sell it to our populations who will need to spend more money on defense when we get back home. And that wasn't the message coming out. The message was all about the welfare of President Biden, and some NATO country ambassadors who I spoke to said, actually, yeah, that's a worry. That distraction is a worry. I thought it was super interesting when President Zelensky met with President Biden. They also had a one-on-one, but they do that bit before they go in, sit in front of the cameras and read their messages. And President Biden's sitting there reading from his cue cards, and you think, okay, he's relying on his cue cards. Then the camera goes to Zelensky, and Zelensky's going to read his lines. And he reads from cue cards. This is a guy whose background is in TV.
Yeah.
He knows visual messaging. And it was like, okay, the young guy in the room needs cue cards too. It was such a potential, we don't really know how it was planned, stage prop to support Biden at this moment. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, as you say, the visual medium, television, the messaging sending between a younger leader and, an older leader and the scrutiny around that. Nick, it's so good to see you in London. Thank you so much.